Hey, welcome back. So today we're diving into something huge, the 700-year history of the rich in the Western world. We're using Guido Alfani's incredible book As Gods Among Men as our guide to explore how fortunes were made, what wealth even is, and how its place in society has been completely turned upside down. Let's get right into it. So, let's kick things off with the most basic question of all. What does it actually mean to be rich? It sounds simple, right? But the answer has changed so dramatically over the centuries. I mean, is a wealthy person someone who owns vast lands and herds of cattle? Or is it someone with a massive but totally intangible stock portfolio? The answer to that question actually tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the world we live in. And you won't believe the scale of this transformation. It's just immense. If we go back to 15th century Florence, one of the richest places on earth at the time, more than half of all wealth was tied up in real estate. Land, buildings, tangible stuff you could actually touch. Now, fast forward to the US in 2020, and that picture is completely flipped on its head. Over 73% of wealth is now held in financial assets. So get this, the whole game has changed. We've gone from a world where wealth was about property to one that's completely dominated by stocks, bonds, and digital portfolios. Okay, so we've seen that what wealth is has changed. But what about the how? How have the super rich actually built these massive fortunes over the last 700 years? Well, Alfani's incredible work really boils it all down to three main paths that honestly just keep showing up again and again throughout history. First, you've got inheritance, the classic, age-old method of just being born into it. Then there's innovation, the one we all love to celebrate, the path of the entrepreneur. And finally, you have finance, maybe the most controversial of them all, the art of making money from money. For the longest time, we're talking centuries here, that first path was really the only one that mattered, being born rich. This was the world of the nobility, where wealth was all about your hereditary status and, most importantly, the land you owned. But here's the thing, that old system, it was always under pressure from new money trying to elbow its way in. And this tension, it's perfectly captured in the story of the Crozat family back in 17th century France. They were merchants who got so incredibly rich that they just started buying up noble titles to climb the social ladder. But the established aristocracy, well, they were not impressed. As the book puts it, the old nobility took offense at the parvenu, the newcomer. It's just a perfect example of that timeless clash between old money and new money. All right, path number 2, innovation. Now, this is the story we absolutely love to celebrate today, the visionary entrepreneur who builds something totally new, whether it's during the Industrial Revolution or in Silicon Valley. But as history shows us, this path has two very different faces. On one hand, you've got figures like Josiah Wedgwood. I mean, this guy was the 13th son of a pretty ordinary potter, but through just sheer, relentless experimentation, he created the world-famous Wedgwood porcelain and even got himself into the Royal Society. That's the story we love. But then, you've got the dark side. Take Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a governor for the Dutch East India Company. He built a fortune by getting a monopoly on nutmeg. And how did he do it? By orchestrating what the book calls a form of ethnic cleansing in the Banda Islands, where over 90% of the local population died. It's just a brutal reminder that innovation and, frankly, ruthless exploitation have often gone hand in hand. And that, of course, brings us to our third and maybe the most historically complicated path of all, finance. I mean, today we think of Wall Street as this engine of immense wealth, right? But for centuries, the very idea of making money from money was, well, it was seen as deeply wrong. And to really get why, you have to understand the medieval concept of usury. It didn't just mean charging crazy high interest. It meant charging any interest at all. The argument, which actually goes all the way back to Aristotle, was simple. Money is sterile. It doesn't generate more money on its own. And this created this deep cultural suspicion of financiers that really echoed for hundreds of years. But despite all that suspicion, the power of finance just became undeniable. So much so that by the early 20th century, a single private financier could literally hold the fate of an entire nation in his hands. During the massive financial panic of 1907, before there was a Federal Reserve, it was J.P. Morgan who personally stepped in, organized a bailout, and saved the entire U.S. financial system from collapse. Think about that. He was basically a one-man central bank, a display of power that was incredible and, for a lot of people, pretty terrifying. Okay, so we've seen the how these fortunes are made. But now for the big question. what does all that concentrated wealth actually do? I mean, what's the real impact on society? And if you look at the data today, the concentration is, well, it's staggering. Just look at this chart showing the share of total wealth held by just the top 1% in 2020. In the United States, over 35%. And look, this isn't a new thing, though the source of that concentrated wealth has definitely changed. And this massive shift is captured perfectly in this one absolutely stunning number from 1906 Britain. Over two-thirds, 67.2%, of the biggest inherited fortunes came from industry and commerce, not from the old landed aristocracy. This right here was the moment you could say new money definitively triumphed over old. So you have to ask, right, how on earth was this incredible concentration of wealth justified for so long? For centuries, the main argument was that the rich had this vital social function. This quote from the 15th century humanist Poggio Braccioli just nails it. The idea was that the rich were like social barns of money. Their massive fortunes were a reserve that the whole community could use in a crisis, like a war or a famine. Money was the nervous system of the city, and the rich were its keepers. But that raises a really crucial question. Is that justification, that social contract, still valid today? Let's take a look at how wealth and the wealthy hold up when they're put to the ultimate test, a major crisis. I mean, you look throughout history, events like the Black Death, the World Wars, the Great Recession, they completely shake up the social order. So what happens to the rich and what happens to inequality when society is put on trial like this? And this is where we find one of the most surprising and I think important takeaways from Alfani's entire work. Just look at this comparison. After the Black Death in the 14th century, which wiped out about a third of Europe's population, wealth inequality actually decreased, and dramatically. Why? Well, because labor all of a sudden became super scarce and way more valuable, which shifted the entire economic balance. But now, look at the COVID-19 pandemic. The result was the exact opposite. Wealth inequality increased significantly as the rich, whose fortunes were mostly in financial assets, profited from booming markets. That traditional social role of the rich in a crisis seems to have been completely turned on its head. Okay, so after this whirlwind tour of 700 years, what's the bottom line? What do we really need to take away from all this? First, what we even think of as wealth has totally transformed, from physical land to abstract finance. Second, while the ways people get rich have evolved, that intense concentration of fortunes is a pattern that just keeps repeating. Third, for centuries, that concentration was justified by a kind of social contract. The rich were supposed to act as a safety net during a crisis. But finally, as we've just seen, recent crises have seriously challenged that contract, often making inequality worse, not better. And all of this leaves us with one final and I think pretty crucial question for all of us today. As wealth concentration is now nearing levels we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, and those old justifications for it are being seriously tested, are we just watching the same historical patterns play out all over again, right before our eyes?